So, hey, I'm going to bring it over to Mitch Johnson, who helps lead our advisory council and has been a cornerstone, has been the building block for this entire event today and many others. I've known Mitch for 25 years and he's been a stalwart. So I want to say thank you, Mitch, for all your contributions. And I look forward to your conversation with these brilliant minds. And I hope you have a great conversation and enjoy the day.
Great. Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, let me first acknowledge how much I enjoyed the presentations from General Levy and from Dr. Hotez, touching on a wide range of themes. I think needless to say, after listening to both of them, it's clear that national security is a much broader and more complex endeavor than just DOD. So it's been great to listen to both of them. I'm now, it's my pleasure now to bring on board the first panel session that we have today. We will continue with the overarching theme of supply chain resilience and national security. Our panel is comprised of leaders who have come to share their insights and their experiences pertaining to leading innovation and technologies, as well as new and creative models for more effective collaboration. So I'm going to welcome each of my panelists. We look forward to a lively and enlightening dialogue over the next hour. Because we have a lot of ground to cover, I am going to offer some quick introductions of each of our four panelists, and I will begin with Vianey Swann. Hello, Vianey. Vianey works. Great to have you. Vianey works for Roche Molecular Solutions in Pleasanton, California. She and her team are leading the way in global procurement for the R&D efforts there at Roche. Vianey has a background in biochemical engineering and a passion for artificial intelligence and its applications for positively disrupting R&D practices to accelerate science for the benefit of patients. So welcome aboard, Vianey.
Thank you.
Next, I'm going to introduce Nigel Thurlow of the Flow Consortium. Hello, Nigel. Nigel is formerly Chief of Agile at Toyota, creator of the award-winning and internationally recognized best-in-class training course entitled Scrum, the Toyota Way. He is co-creator of the Flow system, and as I said, presently CEO of the Flow Consortium. Nigel serves as an advisor on several boards at the University of North Texas, is an accomplished author and well-known global keynote speaker. Welcome aboard, Nigel.
Thanks, Mitch.
You bet. All right, next, I am very pleased to be joined by my own Curtis Process Consulting colleague, Mr. Randy Bowen. Randy leads the process intelligence practice for Curtis Process Consulting, in short CPC. And Randy has over 20 years experience in management consulting across a diverse range of industries, including healthcare and biopharmaceuticals, where the focus typically is operations, supply chain, and logistics in nature. Randy earned his bachelor's degree from Penn State, holds a master's in management of information technology from the University of Virginia, as well as a postgraduate degree in marketing from the University of Leicester in the UK. Welcome aboard, Randy. All right, last but certainly not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Rich Jarvis. Rich is the CEO of Blueprints Lab and co-founder of Waco Ventures, which is an early growth technology investment firm. Again, he's CEO of Blueprints Lab, which is a founding member and developer of the Lab to Market Collaborative at Baylor University, providing IP capitalization and commercialization methodologies, supporting tools, and program management. So welcome, Rich.
Thank you.
All right, well, just a few ground rules before we get started. I'm going to ask each panelist a question to which they will have about 3 minutes to respond, and then we'll open the floor up for hopefully some interactive and spicy interchange, allowing for some color commentary from fellow panelists. So with that said, and with the time allocation we've got today, we're shooting to have 2 rounds of questions per panelist, and at about the 5 to 10 minute mark remaining in our allotment, I'm going to open it up for closing remarks, a 1 minute closing remark for each panelist. So we'll see how my plan works out, right? Okay. All right. Well, first up, first question of the afternoon here is for Vianey. Vianey, given past and ongoing COVID-19 response challenges, what are your key lessons learned regarding building a more agile and resilient supply chain?
Sure, Mitch. Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and first of all, thank you for having me. It's the need of having a plan. In our case, we're a global company, therefore our plans are global. So we have global strategies, which made a difference during the beginning of the pandemic, because we have these plans prepared for regional and local implementation. They were flexible enough to account for this sudden change in the market. And of course, you have to keep this in mind, going forward, just because we feel that we're in the long term for this issue. Areas, for example, on PPE, solvents, and certain services, they require to have that flexibility to maintain our right to operate. Second, I think that proactive versus reactive sourcing is very important. We constantly had the chance to look for additional sources of supply, which were readily available to absorb these fluctuations in demand. In our case, we figured out that it was good to include both distributors and manufacturers. So, for example, when some of the distributors lost the universities because they were closed, we were able, and we were happy and lucky to tap onto that supply, because then we were not in a crunch. But you have to be proactive to find those opportunities. And I think lastly, to bring this to the comment that Dr. Hoti said about bringing small pharma into vaccine production, you have to do the same thing on the supply. So we need to bring smaller suppliers to be part of our supply base, not only because sometimes in the process they get lost. We're too big of a company, and sometimes we don't really see them, we don't really work with them. However, in this case, these smaller companies were the ones that made a difference, not only for us in helping us to maintain our operations, but also they made a difference in the communities that they are located at.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing those insights, Vianey. Let me open it up to the panel for comments or questions for Vianey, or embellishments on the messages that she shared. Don't be shy, guys.
Hey, Vianey, what have you seen as the biggest challenge to the change and because you come from an agile background, and I may know a little bit about this agile thing apparently, but what's been the biggest resistance to the shift you've had to make, given the last sort of 12 or 18 months we've gone through?
You're gonna make me give away my final thoughts, but here you go. I think the most challenging thing is ourselves, because you have to have a flexible mindset in such a way not to just be married with your original global strategy. You have to be flexible enough to recognize that you have to change or you're gonna stop the line. Can't do that. You have to have that mentality in such a way that you allow for those changes. But last year, those changes happened pretty fast. Within a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you had to have something up and running because we were closing. So I think it starts with the individual, and it also starts with having a vision in terms of making sure that you are diversified enough so you can absorb these changes. They could go up or down. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm not going to give away my comments on robustness and resilience, which will come shortly. But no, I'm hearing everything you're saying, but I'd love to hear from Randy and Rich on that.
Gentlemen, anything to add? All right. Well, then we will press on. And next up is Nigel. Nigel, your first question is, and I'll preface the asking of the question with, for me anyway, it's always made a lot of sense that, we value what we measure. So shouldn't we in turn then measure what we value? Which leads me to the question, what are the key measurements that can help us achieve greater supply chain robustness and resilience?
So ask me a simple question, Mitch. Wow, that's a huge question. Most organizations tend to measure costs and efficiencies, and we heard about the effectiveness and efficiency when General Levy was speaking earlier, but this does nothing to measure outcomes. Recent events with the pandemic, and now for a lot of us, you included, hell freezing over in Texas, has shown us that profits matter more than customers and outcomes. And this greed thing I may return to a little bit later on. Deming had 14 points of profound knowledge, and most people know who Deming was. Point 4, he says, end the practice of awarding business on price alone, and instead minimize total cost by working with a single supplier. And that's a lesson I think that a lot of supply chains in government bodies and the military need to think about. And point 11, he says, eliminate numerical quotas for the workforce and numerical goals for the management. And I stuck these on my computer screen earlier so I could remember how I'd written them. And point 12, remove barriers that rob people of pride of workmanship and eliminate the annual rating or merit system, which is a huge topic in itself. And so I'll throw in a little bit more wisdom. I'm from a Toyota background, so I'll throw in a bit of wisdom from Taiichi Ohno. He actually said just in time more precisely means exactly on time. And when he was interviewed by Ito-san, one of the Japan's greatest businessmen and industrialists, very famous guy, Ohno said, if you reduce the inventory to 0, you'll run out of stock at the supermarket, and then your customers will be robbed by other stores. So in other words, they'll go somewhere else. So in simple terms, be lean, not mean. So you asked me what we should measure for robustness and resilience is, I guess, what we're sort of talking about here. And the first thing to be clear on is what those terms actually mean. Robustness, and this is when I was listening to the previous speaker, robustness is how well your supply chain or system can resist an event like the pandemic or like the weather in Texas. And we saw in Texas, we had minimal or probably zero robustness as 15 million people lost water, heat, and power, and still many millions are still without water, even days after we're now enjoying 77 degrees of temperature today, which is where I'll be going after the conference. So resilience is how fast you can recover from an event. So if your supply chain is disrupted, how quickly can it actually recover? Robustness is resist, resilience is recover. In Texas, the gas stations had run dry and supermarkets are stripped bare like they were in the beginning of the pandemic. Can we replenish stocks the same day in 24 hours, a week or more? That's resilience. So we need to start thinking about the customer and the outcomes and the needs of the market, and not just the corporate pocketbook. Unless you want to follow the likes of people like Nokia into history, then you need to stress test your supply chains with use cases and scenarios. And when I say test, I mean actually get out of your chair, get out of the office, go to Gemba, to the place the work actually happens on the supply chain, and actually test them. Stop looking at spreadsheets and PowerPoint decks and start understanding your supply chains and not some notion of them. Work as done versus work as imagined. Actually understand how stuff happens rather than how you imagine it happens. So measure what it takes to meet demand. What would it take to meet surge demand? How your supply chains would react to an interruption or a global event like COVID. And I'd like to go back and ask some of these organizations, maybe we'll during this discussion, what they've implemented to prevent a similar impact next time. That's robustness. Seeing my local supermarket this week, I'd say not a lot. We just waited for normal to return and did nothing. In fact, has normal even returned from pre-pandemic service levels? I don't think so. And as of yesterday, we still couldn't find milk in the supermarkets in Texas. The shelves are still bare, even though we've got beautiful warm temperatures. So what did we learn from the pandemic? It seems not a great deal. So measure how long it takes to recover and why it took as long as it did. How do you improve that? Because no one seems to be learning. We just seem to be reacting. Mitch.
Great. Thank you for that, Nigel. Anyone have a response or questions for Nigel?
Yeah, no, not so much a question, but more of a comment. I think, a lot of what you're talking about in terms of replenishment is a lot of that's occurring at the final mile. And, one of the things that, we'll talk a little bit about, I think, in a bit is how do you kind of foresee these things happening, but take it up the supply chain? That in a lot of cases is how do you get it from the manufacturer? How do you ensure as a manufacturer that you can kind of see what demand is coming for what items? And that's hard to predict. There are some different models that you can use to do that. But ultimately, it's got to funnel through. As sitting on this end, we talked about supermarkets. Or a supermarket, for whatever reason, when it's going to snow, at least where I am in Virginia, everybody runs out and they get the whites, right? Milk, bread, Chardonnay, as they like to say. So, so ensuring that you have, if you know that a storm is coming, that you have plenty on hand. But as a manufacturer, how do you go back and ensure that you're preparing a proper stock or inventory? I mean, and I think that falls into defense logistics as well, right? There are a lot of different things that can happen in the course of an event that require some sort of analysis, really.
It's interesting what you say, Randy, about the last mile, because I was in the local supermarket, and while I was in there was a local farmer in, because hey, we live in Texas and there are a lot of farms here. And they were talking about having to dump 40,000 gallons of milk because the supply chain couldn't pull the milk in time. Now, you're right. We can predict what's going to happen with the weather. We've got pretty accurate models now. We knew the cold was coming to Texas. We didn't know how severe it would be, but we do know that certain things like you described, those key essentials, get pulled on whenever people panic buy, or whether we have a situation where we may not be able to get to the stores for a few days. And the question is, why don't the supply chains react? I mean, I have some ideas on this, and we'll get into that probably a little bit later on. But these are some of the questions I have to push back on the industry to say, you knew this was coming. It's not your first rodeo. Why the hell did you allow the shelves to run out? Why couldn't you have had refrigerated trunkers sitting in the parking lot? And as the shelves ran out, you got overflow supplies there. The systems are in place to be able to pull on that. Why not use them? I think I have a theory of why not, but Randy.
Right, exactly. And in those situations, well, I think what we're seeing, and speaking of those kinds of supplies, they tend to be pulls versus perhaps looking at a model where it's more of a push. So as a manufacturer, you understand, or a supplier, you understand what your clients are potentially going to need and push that inventory in. It does require, to your point, at the board level, a complete sort of change of mindset to say, hey, we're willing to accept the push as long as the manufacturer is sitting there saying, okay, well, we're willing to take the return if we were wrong, But yeah, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along.
Great, fellas. Well, that was a great exchange. And now that your vocal cords are warmed up, Randy, the next question is coming your way. And it's actually two-part. So we know the importance of the importance that new technologies can play in advancing supply chain performance. That said, can you describe to us what is process intelligence and what role can it play in improving supply chain resilience? Now, also in explaining what process intelligence tools are and how they can be leveraged, can they, shall we say, see around the corner for the next upcoming supply chain problems? Over to you.
Yeah, so great question. In the past, supply chains were more of a linear chain, right? That moved parts and from manufacturing to the marketplace. And today they're more of a web that extends and branches out in every single direction. So when I think about supply chain resilience, I think about how to adapt and change a relatively stable process to be able to survive in the face of a turbulent or uncertain environment, right? To kind of anticipate and predict the unexpected. So traditionally, as you know, they tended to be designed with more of a steady state in mind. So there are a lot of technologies out there that can assist in monitoring traditional supply chain operations. But if you're a firm, what do you do in order to hedge against those factors that are atypical or unplanned for? I mean, how do you become aware of something that could have a significant impact on your supply chain when at best you have very little awareness of its existence in the first place? So process intelligence seeks to unify multiple streams of data, and we leverage cognitive automation and technologies. And we think of, typically, I'm sure everybody on this call, the type of cognitive automation we think about is RFID. It can instantly relay the exact location and position of an item anywhere in your supply chain. And the information provides this instantaneous insight. However, when you combine it with other technologies such as machine vision and big transactional data, process intelligence can begin to make inferences regarding what is about to or likely going to happen. So PI, or process intelligence, PI, is about the rapid translation of big data using machine learning algorithms. And it's the convergence of process visualization, data science, and process mining analytics. And I get asked a lot, why process intelligence? Well, operations and supply chain performance is improved. You get increased resilience, inventory accuracy, traceability, cost reduction, control, and a lot of benefits like that. And understandably, the more data you're going to push into the model and the more data you get to analyze, the more accuracy you can expect. So at CPC, for example, we synthesize speech. We parse written and oral communications from a variety of different mediums, like social media, for example. And we incorporate those into the models that we build for our clients. So in effect, we enable our clients to see the entirety of the supply chain in real time and provide them with advanced analytics that instantly flag events of potential importance to its smooth running. I mean, in that way, our clients are able to quickly make determinations and apply mitigants before issues turn into problems and failures.
Great. Well, thank you, Randy. Comments or questions for Randy?
I'm going to pivot on what Vianey was saying earlier on. She talks about mindsets. Now, I think mindsets are an emergent thing. You can't teach somebody a mindset. You can give a philosophy and people can choose to align to it and then develop a mindset. But on that point, and to what Randy, because Randy talked a lot about data and data insights and machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence. The information is there. I mean, I'd argue we've always had the information. It's now better available and more rapidly available in many different ways to consume. But do you not think there's more of a basic sort of human problem at the root of all this, which is that thing called greed or profit or something else? And I think we need to address that, because Ono talked about something called supplier bullying, which is bad Kanban for those that understand lean supply chains, which is pushing the inventory. It's the dirty secret of lean. I may refer to this again. You're pushing the inventory to somebody else to hold it. And then when you need it, regardless of what insights tell you need it, you can't get it fast enough. And that's what happened when the global supply chains collapsed, when the pandemic shut down all modes of travel earlier in the year. So, Vianey, I see you unmuted. I'm sure you've got some insights into this, based on what you were saying about the mindsets of people in your organization.
Yes, and I think that the key to this is to actually put the two of them together. With the right mindset and the right tools, you have a winner, because if we use the information to drive our decisions, then the question becomes, where are we going to put our resources to make sure that the supply chain does not just break? And so I think that it is brilliant that if we combine the two, but for that you have to have certain predisposition of accepting new things, of not thinking that the machine might be lying to you of some sort. So it's more about, I accept this new technology, I accept that this can help me, and then based on that you gain insights to drive your decisions further, whether it is that you find unlikely sources which we have had, or which or you remain with the sources that you have, but in the end the combination of the two is the key.
All right, well, thank you for that, Vianey. I'm going to move us along, and Rich Jarvis, you knew I was eventually going to get to you. How you doing, Rich?
Good, good.
All right, well, we've got a question for you. So we heard earlier how the rapid development of vaccine, I believe Dr. Hotez was talking about the rapid development of vaccine involving many stakeholders. Can you tell us what the COVID-19 environment has been teaching us about the technology commercialization process?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I think, I'm reducing going from supply chain, bringing it back to, let's, talk about technology innovation or technology commercialization, starting with the idea. But listening to all the discussion, hearing, General Levy saying we need new models around collaboration. We need new models for investment. We need better planning, around the supply chain. The same is true, for, bringing technology ideas to market. And, when I think about what took place, in this COVID environment, what can you pull from it? One of the things you heard Dr. Hotez talking about is this new mRNA technology. It was an innovation. It was rapidly created, rapidly deployed. I think it's fascinating and remarkable how quickly it moved. It's got its issues. It's got its supply issues. Actually, I spent 7 years working on RNA technology and RNA delivery technology. And so I understand and can appreciate, the issues that they're facing, but the speed at which they moved, the agility at which they moved was remarkable, I think. And, and I think in order to, move like that, you've got to create the right environment and the right I call it a collaboratory environment. And there's requirements of it. And one is, understanding the need really well, because you can't plan if you don't understand the need, if you don't articulate the need, if you don't define it really well. And sometimes, 95% of commercialization projects fail because they don't actually articulate the need. In the case of the virus and the vaccine, the need was to create a vaccine to promote immunity amongst a broad population, but it was qualified by do it now. And that led to a risk in taking, an RNA, type technology to market, or at least selecting it because it could be synthesized faster and other things like that. And so, and also, going back to, we talked a little bit about, the mindset, the person, the big money, the greed that's involved. Noble purpose, right? There's a noble purpose in developing this vaccine, and that noble purpose led to an alignment of those multi-stakeholders. So you've got to have this, ingredient of there's something bigger to do that will align people, will bring a unity of effort in that sense. And so the environment's important. Also, we talk a lot about the structure. In our world at the university, we say, let's look at the continuum of commercialization, and we break up the phases to inventors, developers, and sellers, so that each can focus on what they do best. And so we talked. I heard the language about push and pull. Well, in this world, right, there's push and pull. There's let's invent something, find a phenomenon and develop it into a technology and the push end of the inventor. But they often do that in isolation without understanding the pull. So they inevitably build a bridge to nowhere. And that's what we call the valley of death. In other words, there's no planning that took place with, looking at the market pull and plan around the market pull to create the right product. But instead, it's just pushed out. And, you've heard about technology readiness levels. Well, the inventor often, completes 1, 2, and 3 out of 9. The pull side, which is investors and industry, are looking for 7, 8, 9, but no one's doing the 4, 5, 6 in between, which is the concept validation, the tech validation, the customer validation. But all of that could be accomplished with big data. I think to some of Randy's points earlier, you can create a path by looking at the big data on the tech space, the IP space, the market space, begin to put paths together to say, okay, this tech should land here, and we know where the pull is, and we begin to guide early invention toward that pull. That would make the process more efficient. We're starting to do some of that work now. It collapses timeframes and moves things along a lot better. So, it's kind of like, how do we simulate the pandemic environment, and utilize it, now and begin to, and it requires new thinking. I think that was a point well made. All of this requires new thinking. And so anyways, yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Rich. I'm keeping an eye on the time, folks. So I'm going to move us along to question number 2 for Vianey. Vianey, what are the looming challenges to achieving greater supply chain resilience as this pandemic continues on into 2021?
Sure. Well, I think that first we need to recognize that this problem is not going to end tomorrow. So we're here for the long run. The second thing is, I definitely want to emphasize that we need to have flexibility on the planning. And very, very important, because you might realize that there's certain commodities that are okay today, but that might not be okay tomorrow. So you have to be very flexible to adapt to those changes. I also believe that, based on the use of new technology, we can definitely predict what the supply is going to look like, but we can also secure supply using technology from more likely, unlikely sources, sources that you didn't even know existed before. Another thing is, once you find these unlikely sources of supply, you need to have a very good process for onboarding, which I'm sure we are all in pain when we try to bring, someone new. You have all the paperwork, all the red tape. We have to be more agile in those processes. And lastly, one thing that was very painful to go through is your critical components. We have to know what the critical components are. And I'm not talking about raw materials. I'm talking about the paper clip that you don't have that is going to stop production, because all of those can make a big difference in your right to operate. So we need to make sure that those are readily identified and that you have at least more than a couple of sources. Good example, pipette tips. Who would have known that we could stop because of the pipette tips? Well, with vaccine production, we have a lot of these consumables being used by everybody. In our case, if we don't have those, then we stop our own production, we stop our own R&D, and that cannot happen. And that is very silly, but very real that is happening today.
Great, thank you, Vianey. Comments for Vianey, panelists, or a question? All right, I will keep us moving along, and we are back to you, Nigel. Question number 2 for you, which is actually 2-part. How do leaders, be they global or national, set the right course regarding supply chain policy? And how do they avoid the pitfalls of deploying strategies that don't balance or optimize short-term and long-term performance?
Yeah, I was watching some of the chat and the comments and some of the questions, and I'm just acknowledging generally the questions there, because there's a lot of things in there about, landfill and recycling and human rights issues and reshoring and a bunch of other things. So I hope we'll get time to get to some of those and comment on them. But, I'm going back to one of the points I wrote down, but that Deming had written earlier on. He says, end the practice of awarding business on price alone. Instead, minimize total cost by working with a single supplier. But this seems to be a weak point in global supply chains. We need diversification of supply. And we just heard that. Multiple sources, but then this contravenes some lean thinking around single supplier. But there are ways to make this work more effectively. Co-location and near-location are strategies, for instance, that Toyota use. And we can probably dig into that a little bit more. We've also got to recognize that offshoring is a reality. And we've been doing offshoring for hundreds of years in modern times and in millennia in ancient times. It's not this whole offshore to Vietnam or to India or to China is not a new thing. When I was a child growing up in the UK, we were offshoring to Hong Kong because Hong Kong on the shores of China now was a British territory at the time. So things were made there, and things were also made in Taiwan. And we're talking in the 1960s and early 70s here. And then I remember when we switched production to Japan, everybody didn't want any of that Japanese junk coming into the country. Now it's the best products you can buy in the world. So we've got to recognize that this is something that's not a new phenomenon. We must also sort of recognize that for us to have what we want, someone else must have less. The sort of hidden secret or dirty secret, if you like, of a capitalist lifestyle, just as the dirty secret of lean, is someone somewhere is holding inventory. And I mentioned earlier about Ono sort of mentioning about supplier bullying. So the reality of it is the way we do business will dictate the continued need to make things in lower cost locations, and just shifting from China to India or Vietnam or wherever else doesn't solve that problem. That's more a political issue than a supply chain issue. How you ensure the robustness of the supply chain when stressed and the resilience of it when it fails is what needs to be addressed. So this means more localized inventory, and I'm sure Randy will pivot on this as well with some of his insights that he was giving earlier on. And even Toyota practice this where disruptive events are common. So where they've got places where weather patterns are much more severe, they carry some inventory locally. So they have to carry the cost of that inventory to protect themselves from what we describe as fragility in those unseen events. And maybe diversification of sources, of course, certainly contingency planning and disaster recovery are all critical strategies. You invest in your IT systems for disaster recovery, so why not your supply chains? In production control and logistics system theory, you should never plan an inventory system by attempting to include vague factors such as disasters or accidents whose probability cannot be calculated. So this is about planning, not about planning for all eventualities. This is more about something we call sense making and complexity thinking and weak signal detection. You can't plan for every eventuality, otherwise you'll have so much contingency planning, your costs will be out of control. So it is about how we respond when they occur. And Western doctrine, you know, the US, Europe, Western countries tend to have the doctrine it's their problem when something happens. But when you spend a lot of time in Japan, as I've been fortunate to do, the Eastern doctrine is, which is exemplified by Toyota, of course, is it's our problem. And so when supply chains broke down in some of the natural disasters in Japan, Toyota actually went out and rebuilt those supply chains, rebuilt their suppliers after earthquakes and other things that have happened. That's called resilience. And the other thing is Toyota didn't charge for helping their suppliers, because that's about establishing a robust and resilient supply chain. So the key here really is to abandon politics and pocketbooks and focus on the flow of value, something, of course, I'm very focused on. Outcomes and customers and not costs and margins. This doesn't mean we abandon fiscal common sense and the lunatics start running the asylum, but it does mean we make the customer's needs primary. And I think Toyota's been doing a pretty good job of that for the last 7 decades. And the last time I checked, they were doing okay as a profitable company as well. So we got to abandon the greed and focus more on the need. I'll hand that back to you, Mitch.
Yeah, I'm hearing a little different version of collaboration theme coming out there within the supply chain stakeholders. That's very interesting stuff. Thank you, Nigel. We're right on time, folks, so I'm going to keep us moving. Next question for Randy Bowen. Randy, you talked about process intelligence earlier. Do you think that PI could have foreseen the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the pharmaceutical supply chain?
Yeah, so it's a good question. You know, a lot of people that I've spoken to, they like to describe the COVID-19. I've heard it described a lot as a black swan event, but in reality, you know, I don't see it that way. For it to be a black swan event, COVID really needed to be an outlier, something that should have been considered so outside the realm of expectations that nobody could have been able to see it coming. And you know, if we go back to around 2005, George W. Bush delivered a speech at the NIH warning about the next pandemic. President Obama did the same in 2014. So clearly this current pandemic was not unexpected, and we should have seen it coming, right? So we saw these signals and these indicators. Pandemics are real. And they happen from time to time, and they have devastating consequences for populations, industries, and the government. So, but one of the things that COVID has really taught us is that nothing is steady state. So remember, I talked earlier about supply chains traditionally being designed for steady state. COVID taught us that they're not. And especially when you're talking about a global supply chain versus a national or localized type of supply chain. So, you know, as Mitch mentioned earlier, I have a lot of background in medical device and biopharmaceuticals, specifically around logistics and manufacturing. And those industries, I believe, are particularly aware of the risk of pandemics and other widespread health emergencies. Earlier on in this session, in the symposium, we heard about Ebola. The Ebola scare here in the United States, which was, I believe, 2014 through 2016, caused a huge mobilization in both the healthcare and med device industries. So these instances, or in these instances, the medical device industry in particular, suffered from a lack of supply chain transaction and inventory visibility. They just didn't have it. But with expanded cognitive automation technologies, real-time intelligence, actionable recommendations could have served to reduce disruption time, both for that particular episode as well as for COVID-19. At CPC, with process intelligence, we pay particular attention to what we call frequency-based thresholds. And that's essentially the frequency of the breaching of these thresholds. And when you combine these breaches, when thresholds exceeded, with big data analysis of outcome scenarios, our clients are then able to kind of see around the corner a little bit and prepare against invisible gaps. So most manufacturers have already developed plans for supply chain disruptions, different types of episodes, be it an ice storm or pandemic. But we can typically leverage a process intelligence to understand other factors that might give them an indication of what's coming around the bend. So the benefits of process intelligence extends beyond just the traditional manufacturing environment. For example, it can help solve challenging procurement problems for the DoD, knowing what's coming, being able to see around the curve, if you will, and essentially provide faster fielding of vital equipment, supplies, and capabilities to the warfighter.
Thank you, Randy. We have time for a question or a few comments. All right, thank you, Randy. I'm going to move us on then to a second question for Rich. Rich, you mentioned the term collaboratory as part of your response to question one. Can you elaborate a bit more on what this means? And given your own experience, what are the key elements that make these multiple stakeholder collaboratory environments work?
Sure. Well, I like what Nigel said a minute ago. I think he said, abandon the greed and focus on need. That's kind of where I started. The right environment is necessary for collaboration to work, and it begins with that. It begins with hanging up your competitive hat, right, and deciding to sit down, roll up your sleeves, throw everything that you have on the table, and say, I'm willing to throw in my intellectual property. I'm willing to throw in my my investment, my capability. I'm willing to contribute time and talent, right, and whatever treasure I have to solve a need. And that environment doesn't normally exist in normal business ways of doing things. And so it just simply requires a whole new way to think. And one of the things that we've experimented with is the physical environment being outside of the company at a university. So at Baylor, what we found and what we're discovering is when you create a neutral environment, a nonprofit research center, for instance, or a university, and invite the small and medium-sized companies, invite the big primes and say, hey, let's play, let's create a sandbox, let's set up some rules, let's define the outcomes, what happens with IP, what happens with the revenues, and begin to define those streams, because it's critical to do that. That's one of the biggest problems we have to overcome in this collaboratory world is, what does the economics look like? Because everyone has someone to answer to, right? But up front, if you can promote the solving of the need as primary, right, and secondary, how do we solve this economic problem? You have a good foundation. And so in this collaboratory world at a university, we say, we invite you, here's a university. They're not going to pull your IP. You're safe. So we're kind of creating a safe environment, reduce the fear, reduce the friction, right? Reduce as best we can the risk, and invite those folks in. And I think that's you know, it's a starting place. We have 3 projects that are taking off with some big companies, small inventors, university professors serving as glue to put projects together, and bringing up the questions of finance at the end. But we have a framework for it, contracts that we think are going to work quite well to define some of those things. But you got to create that neutral environment. You got to create that place, and then you got to couple that with a disciplined process, so everyone understands the flow and when and you know, they're expected to contribute what, and bring in again the right data, so data-driven decisions could be made along the way. So, you know, it's coupling those 2 things together. You know, the right environment, setting sort of the principles and values up front, understanding where the finances flow, and then having a process.
Great. Comments or questions for Rich?
I was writing a bunch of notes down when he was talking, but I won't sort of hog too much of the time. But certainly, psychological safety and active listening were 2 key elements that that Rich was sort of referring to in my language, which are absolutely critical. I was reading one of the comments as well, which sort of leans a little bit. This Avishal Jar asked, you know, for Randy and myself to follow up on bit how to, you know, motivate big pharma, large pharma to update the way they do, you know, things PI and etc. When we talked about data, there's another thing from my Toyota training. There's a difference between data and facts. Data can be manufactured, facts cannot. So that's a really important thing. And then to pivot a little bit on what Randy was saying, this is where sense making comes in, which is this: when we're working in a complex world, which is an unordered, a chaotic world where we can't have a defined process that says do this followed by that. That's something called linear causality. That works fine in the ordered world, in the complicated and sort of, you know, simple areas of our lives. In the Toyota production system, that's an ordered world, very complicated but very ordered, linear causality. When you get into fighting things like COVID and major global problems, we could go down a real rat's nest with this, so I won't take us there, I promise. Then we need a different way of thinking, which is where Rich was sort of alluding to. So this is where we do need to look at different collaborative sort of techniques. What is the purpose motive here rather than the profit motive, to sort of coin something Dan Pink wrote about some years ago. So I think these are some of the really important things. And I think we as individuals, as consumers, play a role in that. Not just the leaders and the people involved in making these decisions, but as consumers, if we want a different world, we have to think about what we desire personally, because our own greed is we want more stuff, we want it cheaper. And the only way to achieve that is to make to have some sort of, you know, pushing things away from America. So if we want to reshore things and we want to make ourselves more resilient, more robust, then we as individuals have to be prepared to forego some of the benefits of offshoring everything. And I think these are some of the key things. Rich, I see you nodding and wanted to jump in there.
You know, yeah, there's so much there that we can unpack that you shared, and you know, I think, you know, we talk even about new models of, you know, I think Levy was talking about, we need new models of investment, of capitalization. Well, when you build the right environment, the right people doing the right things, contributing, right? In other words, knowing that when they come in, you know, I only want to take away this. I don't need it all. I just want to come home with this. And we set that up at, like, you know, the inventor at the university, you don't need the patent, assign it. What you really want is sponsored research. That's just one key that led to a beautiful set of contracts. Right. But in other words, what's enough? And if you determine that, the collaboratory begins to work and function, and then it's attractive. It attracts dollars earlier because they see a process. We have investors that said, you know, I don't even care what tech you have. I love your process. I love your collaboratory. I love what you're doing. And I want to be part of that. You tell me about the tech, but I see what you're doing is a little bit different. And so it becomes attractive when you do it right. When you remove that greed and you move in a different direction, we're saying, you know what? This is enough for me. I don't need the rest. I'm good here. It makes it very attractive, and it's almost magnetic.
Yeah, folks, you know what? There's so much to talk about and so little time. I'm sure that we have many of our folks that have joined us virtually today have a lot of questions. But we've reached that point now to where we're going to go around the horn and give you guys a chance to offer kind of what parting, 1 minute parting comment. What do you not want folks to leave without today? And we'll go in the same order. Vianey, closing remarks.
All right, so I would say 3 things. Be comfortable in the face of uncertainty and be ready to change your assumptions. That's key. Have a backup plan that includes diversification of supply, which could be small suppliers, diverse supplies, startups, you name it. And lastly, I would say let technology be your ally on discovering new opportunities. Thank you for having me, Mitch, and the rest of the panelists.
Our pleasure, Vianey. Nigel, closing comments.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wrote something down. I'm actually going to tell you what I wrote down. But the ownership of change is being forced on consultants. When that needs to be handed back to the organizations and companies, they need to own the change. We get hired as consultants, a lot of us here, and I've done it all my life. But we rapidly become what somebody told me yesterday was insultants. Every time we tell you something you don't want to hear, you feel insulted, but you hired us to tell you this. So my job, therefore, is not to tell you what you need to do. My job is to help you see what you need to do. My job is to teach you to learn to see. When you see what needs to change, you need to pull the and-on cord, for those that know the metaphor, and take immediate action to solve the problem. Get out of the boardroom, go to the workplace, and things may improve a little bit.
Well said, sir. Well said. Randy.
Yeah. So, in the comments, I was reading through the questions that were going on in the chat, and a lot of people, or some people were talking about, pink flamingos. There was some conversations around what are the risks of handling control over to factors that we don't understand, for example, around artificial intelligence. And I would encourage everyone to just consider the speed with which we are able to adapt. You think of rapid prototyping, especially in manufacturing. You can switch a manufacturing line in many cases just by downloading a new template for manufacturing. So for specifically in relation to how do we support our fighting forces and the military, the faster we can become aware of a need or a requirement out in the field, we have the ability digitally these days to turn it around and start manufacturing it. So in the light of all of that, to kind of take both of my points and kind of assemble them together, was how did we miss so badly on the coronavirus and the COVID-19 impacts? And are there other things that are occurring out there, other signals that we're seeing that we're potentially missing as organizations? So I would encourage everyone to strongly sit down and consider the different factors that might play into it. Because look, if you've ever done this like I have, you go online and you see an ad for something that you were talking about to somebody else 20 minutes before, and you're like, how did they know I was talking about the Ford Mustang? And all of a sudden I see a Ford Mustang ad. Well, it's not because they're listening in, it's because they're observing behaviors. So these technologies are real, this functionality is real, and I say encourage people to leverage it.
There's a lot to be learned out there. Yeah, thank you, Randy. And last but not least, closing remarks, Mr. Jarvis.
Yeah, so I'm not going to read mine either because so much is stirring in my head. I've got notes all over the place. But I think the takeaway for me has been: don't wait for crisis to think different, right? Don't wait for that to take place to make a shift. We talked about planning. We talked about you got to understand the outcomes and simulate that environment now. And that's in other words, collaboratories or collaboration is a way to begin to say, we're going to simulate something different. We're going to take on the ideas of many to produce something, and we're going to do it in a way that works for everyone, right? We've got to struggle through that because that's required for speed and agility. We're not going to have it any other way. In other words, we need to know where all the pieces of the puzzle are, use artificial intelligence, add them together, use human, validation of those things to make sure they're real. And then put the right projects together and making sure that bridge from one side to the other is complete. And I think we could do that, but it requires new thinking and really the beginning of building new cultures.
All right. Well, thank you, Rich. And thank you, all of the panelists. Really appreciate what you've brought to bear today. I think you guys had a great chemistry. I think we could do another hour if we had the time. So it's been very informative, and I'll say I hope the audience enjoyed it half as much as I enjoyed moderating it. So thank you again. Folks, we're going to pivot now toward our intermission. We're going to move here in the next couple of minutes to a 10-minute intermission, resuming at 3:10 Eastern Time, 2:10 Central, with a one-on-one chat moderated by Zahir Ali, and he's going to be joined by Major General Christopher Sharpston to discuss the federal COVID-19 responses. So I'm proud to say that we're actually going to break for intermission a couple of minutes early, which means I must have done something right today. So we'll see everybody. David, ready to roll to intermission?
Absolutely. I just want to say you all are invited back again for another hour, 2 hours, maybe a day. And appreciate all the insights. And I think it was a very interesting discussion. And we look forward to hopefully having you guys back.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you very
guys.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. See you back in about 12 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you.